O God, though my words will be spoken today, may only your word be heard. Amen. Please make yourselves comfortable. What are you waiting for? As you think about your journey of life or the times that we find ourselves in, what is it that you are longing for? What do you desire? More than 20 years ago, the Roman Catholic priest Ronald Rolheiser wrote a book titled The Holy Longing. It was about developing a healthy spirituality and the elements of a healthy spirituality. Rolheiser explained that spirituality is ultimately about what we do with our desire, what we do with our longings, both in terms of the pain and the hope they bring us. In his book, he explains that a healthy spirituality is not about just personal, private prayer, about looking inward to find God. And he explained that it also is not just about advancing justice, that while the work of creating a more just and equitable world is important, that alone does not make for a healthy spirituality. Instead, Rolheiser explains that in order to cultivate a healthy spirituality, he believes there are 4 non-negotiable pillars: private prayer and private morality, social justice, but also community, and what he calls mellowness of heart and spirit. Ultimately, the cultivation of all of these things is about satisfying our deepest longings by finding God and the movement of God in our midst. To put this in language that is more appropriate for the season of Epiphany, the cultivation of these 4 pillars together is all focused on developing the capacity to help us notice the light coming into the world. In the story of the presentation of Jesus at the temple, I think we see an illustration of all of these things coming into play. We read about Simeon, who has reached an old age, but who has remembered God's promise that he would see the Messiah before he died. About prayer, Rolheiser writes, "There is no bad way to pray, and there is no one starting point for prayer. All the great spiritual masters offer only one non-negotiable rule. You have to show up, and you have to show up regularly. Everything else is negotiable." In the story of Simeon, we read of Simeon who has reached his old age, hoping to see God's promise that he would live to see the Messiah. And over that time, he focused and centered his life on temple worship and ritual. And Simeon surely cultivated a practice of prayer that fed his spiritual hungers over and over as he waited and waited for the fulfillment of God's promises. The temple also provided Simeon a community in which to dwell as he waited for some sign, any sign, that the Messiah was in his midst. Rolheiser emphasizes that community is an indispensable part of Christian spirituality. He says that the search for God is not a private search for what is highest for oneself, or even what is ultimate for oneself. Spirituality is about a communal search for the face of God. Within a temple community, Simeon was able to remain connected to a people as he searched for the fulfillment of a promise made to him, but a promise that would be fulfilled for all of Israel. Social justice may not at first be evident in today's gospel, but if we look, I think we can find some evidence of it. Rolheiser writes that social justice has to do with issues of poverty, inequality, war, racism, sexism, let me add, any kind of ism or phobia, and lack of concern for ecology. Because what lies at the root of each of these is not so much someone's private sin, but rather a huge blind system that is inherently unfair. Simeon was not waiting for the one who would bring him riches or personal salvation or absolution of his own individual sins. Instead, Simeon was waiting for the anointed one who would come to bring salvation for all of God's people. God's people were enduring a system that was taxing them into poverty, a system where Rome controlled the economy in ways that benefited the emperor and that remained blind to the needs of the people. The people were even exploited in their temple worship. We read this morning and heard this morning of the 2 doves, the sacrificial doves. You will remember that those 2 sacrificial doves, the way they were sold, and the money changers caused Jesus to flip tables later in his life. Those things already existed at his birth, and Simeon's hope to see the Messiah was a hope that one day God's people would be liberated in every sense of that word and assured salvation in this world and in the world to come. Finally, Rolheiser reminds us that we need what he calls a kind of mellowness of heart. Think back to the elder brother of the prodigal son who holds a kind of bitterness. Or maybe you know someone who can't enjoy something nice, a nice meal or a hotel room, a glass of wine, while knowing that people are suffering in the world. We can do all the right things, and we can also not have any celebration in our heart doing it. No joy. Simeon tends to show us a way to remain grounded in a kind of joy even as he waits and waits and waits for any sign of the Messiah. Simeon knows and believes the promises of God, and he isn't complaining about the length of his journey before he finds what he has been searching for and hoping for over his entire life. Simeon remains grounded in a sense of calm, hoping for an outcome, but seeming to let go of any control of when or how it might happen. As one author put it, only one kind of person transforms the world spiritually: someone with a grateful heart. The story of Simeon reminds us of what we are all called to cultivate in our own lives to maintain and have a healthy spirituality, that we might see and recognize the light of Christ coming in our midst. At times, it can seem as if there is no light in our midst. I think it's fair to say that right now we live in a time of great fear and anxiety, a time of great uncertainty. Many of our siblings and friends and neighbors and loved ones are worried and fearful of what the future will bring and what will happen to them. For some, there is only disappointment and darkness in our midst and around us. But we have faith that God is with us. We are assured that God is with us and that light has broken into the world, and that light cannot be overcome. Love has broken into the world, and despite all the evidence to the contrary, that cannot be overcome. The light of Christ is among us and in each of us, and that can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine, as St. Paul reminds us in another one of his letters. But light is not always easy to see. Hope is not always easy to perceive. But for our part, as we lean into the practice of prayer, as we become more rooted and grounded in our community of faith, as we work for justice in the world around us, and as we cultivate joy and a mellow heart, the capacity to experience and express gratitude, with God's help, we will be better able to see and perceive the work of God, the presence of God with us in our midst. Amen.